In July of 1518, something terrifying happened in the city of Strasbourg. A woman walked into the street and started dancing, not celebrating, not performing, dancing like her life depended on it. She twisted, spun, and stumbled for hours beneath the brutal summer heat. Witnesses thought she had lost her mind. But then something impossible happened. Other people joined her, one by one, then dozens, then hundreds. Within weeks, the city was trapped in a nightmare no one could explain. People danced until their feet bled, until they collapsed, until they died. And the most disturbing part? They couldn't stop. This wasn't a legend. It was documented by physicians, church records, and city officials. Historians still debate what caused it more than 500 years later. And the deeper you go into this story, the more disturbing it becomes. The woman's name was Frau Trophäa. On a hot day in July 1518, she stepped into a narrow street in Strasbourg and began dancing, violently without music. At first people laughed. Her husband reportedly begged her to stop. But she kept moving for hours, then through the night. By the next morning she was still dancing. Her body should have collapsed, but she continued for days. Soon others began showing the same symptoms. A few people joined her involuntarily, then dozens. By August, historical records claim around 400. People were dancing uncontrollably. Throughout the city, some screamed while dancing. Others cried for help. Witnesses described people shaking violently, their faces twisted in agony, begging priests to save them while their bodies refused to stop moving. And here's where the story becomes unbelievably dark. The authorities did not quarantine the dancers. They did not consider it a disease. Instead, Strasbourg's leaders believed the victims would recover if they simply danced the sickness out of their bodies. So they made the situation worse, much worse. The city council ordered musicians to play music for the victims. They hired drummers and violinists. They even built wooden stages specifically for dancing. Imagine that scene for a second. Hundreds of exhausted people collapsing in the streets while musicians continued playing around them. Medieval doctors watched this happen and thought more dancing was the cure. But the cure turned deadly. Historical documents describe people dropping from heart attacks, strokes, exhaustion, and dehydration. Some reportedly danced for days without rest. Shoes filled with blood, bones visible through torn skin. The city transformed into something that sounded less like Europe and more like a horror film. One surviving account claimed victims were dancing themselves to death. And then there's the detail almost nobody talks about. This wasn't the first dancing outbreak in European history. Centuries before Strasbourg, similar incidents appeared across parts of medieval Europe. In 1374, another dancing mania spread along the Rhine River, affecting towns in modern-day Germany, Belgium, and Netherlands. Witnesses described entire groups dancing wildly in the streets for weeks. Some hallucinated, others foamed at the mouth. Priests believed they were possessed by demons. Many thought it was punishment from God. By 1518, Strasbourg citizens already feared something called Saint Vitus's curse, a belief that certain saints could punish sinners with uncontrollable dancing. And in a deeply religious medieval society, fear itself was powerful enough to spread like a virus. Modern historians believe the people of Strasbourg were living under unimaginable stress. The years before the outbreak were catastrophic. Famine had devastated crops. Diseases like smallpox and syphilis were spreading through Europe. The poor were starving. Many believed the apocalypse was near. Strasbourg itself had suffered repeated crop failures and rising food prices. People were exhausted physically, mentally, spiritually. Then one woman started dancing, and the entire city snapped. Some researchers call it mass psychogenic illness, what older generations called mass hysteria. In simple terms, fear and psychological stress become so extreme that symptoms spread physically from person to person. It sounds impossible, but similar events have happened throughout history. In 1962, a laughter epidemic broke out in Tanzania. It began with 3 schoolgirls laughing uncontrollably. Soon hundreds were infected. Schools shut down. The laughter spread for months. Doctors found no physical disease, But the dancing plague of 1518 remains more horrifying because people died. And there's another theory that might be even darker. Some historians believe the victims were poisoned by ergot fungus, a toxic mold that grows on damp rye grain. This fungus contains chemicals related to LSD. Consuming infected bread can trigger hallucinations, muscle spasms, paranoia, and violent convulsions. Medieval Europe suffered several ergot poisoning outbreaks known as St. Anthony's Fire. At first, this explanation sounded convincing. Imagine starving peasants unknowingly, eating poisoned bread and descending into madness. But many modern experts reject this theory for one terrifying reason. Ergot poisoning usually causes painful muscle contractions severe enough to stop people from moving. The victims of Strasbourg danced for days, some for weeks. Physically, that should have been impossible. Which leaves historians trapped between two explanations that both sound unreal. Either hundreds of people were driven into a fatal trance by fear and psychological terror, or something happened to the human mind that science still cannot fully explain. And then, almost as suddenly as it began, the plague disappeared. City authorities eventually changed tactics. Instead of encouraging dancing, they transported victims to a mountaintop shrine dedicated to Saint Vitus. The dancers were forced to wear red shoes, sprinkled with holy water, while priests performed rituals over them. Somehow the outbreak slowly faded away. No cure was discovered. No clear explanation was found. The dancers simply stopped. Think about how terrifying that is. Imagine walking through your city tomorrow and seeing strangers dancing uncontrollably in the streets. Imagine hearing screams outside your window at night while people collapse from exhaustion and then stand up again, still moving. Imagine doctors making it worse because nobody understands what's happening. That was real life in Strasbourg in 1518. And the strangest part is how little people talk about it today. There are no blockbuster movies about it, no famous Netflix series, yet this may be one of the most psychologically disturbing events ever recorded. Because unlike wars or plagues caused by bacteria, this horror came from inside the human mind itself. The dancing plague forces us to ask a terrifying question. How fragile is human reality? Because history shows that under enough fear, starvation, stress, and belief, entire crowds can begin doing things that defy logic. The people of Strasbourg weren't stupid. They weren't acting. They genuinely believed something supernatural was happening to them. Their bodies responded to that belief so powerfully that some danced themselves into graves. Even modern scientists admit there is no complete answer. And maybe that's what makes this story impossible to forget. 500 years later, we still don't know why hundreds of people danced until they died in the streets of Strasbourg. But somewhere in old European archives, hidden beneath faded ink and church records, there are eyewitness accounts from people who watched it happen with their own eyes. They saw neighbors collapse. They heard musicians playing while people screamed in pain. They lived through a moment when reality itself seemed to break apart. A city where dancing became a death sentence. And the truth behind it may be stranger than anything we can imagine.